Gadget groupies. This has been one of my most anticipated camera reviews of the year. Nokia set the stage for building premier optics into their smartphones, and now, finally, after much waiting, we have the first proper Microsoft branded flagship phone to test out. So let's see if the Lumia 950 continues that Nokia legacy of excellence. Starting off with some outdoor bright sunny shots, we've got a juicy, crisp, detailed, high quality UHD video. Throughout most of these examples, I worry that the exposure, saturation, and white balance veer a bit warm. We're dealing with winter sun here in Los Angeles, and the light hitting the ground here isn't quite this golden at midday. Yellows in direct sun walk a very fine line, almost oversaturating and providing a punchy, aggressive color, but this camera does a remarkably good job of reining in exposure here to prevent clipping, and we retain all of those fine crinkles in the petals. Blues and greens pop easily, and the 50 megabit per second bitrate is preventing blocky digital compression artifacts from disrupting the uniform blue of the sky. With this aggressive image profile, it should be expected that reds are going to sizzle, and in some cases come out more magenta. But like the yellows, we're on that razor's edge here before clipping and blowing out highlights. White objects in direct sun are always difficult to expose for, and the 950 hangs on to the subject about as well as can be expected. Performance here is very similar to the V10 when shooting full auto. It's in browns and earth tones where I might be most concerned, as this camera is working really hard to produce a vibrant and lush scene, but this isn't really reflective of what this park actually looks like in real life. It's kind of an ugly dirt patch, which we can see a bit more accurately from a Galaxy smartphone sample shot at the same time. While shooting video, we do have access to some rudimentary controls, manual focus, white balance, and exposure. That exposure setting helps a lot in reining overly bright shots in, but I'm not overly impressed with the white balance mode on Lumias these days. You get 4 presets which represent huge jumps in color temperature, making it very difficult to line up with specific lighting conditions, and adjustments can take up to 20 seconds to shift while shooting video. For such a beautiful app interface, I really think it's time for Microsoft to move to a more precise Kelvin slider like we find on LG and Samsung phones where adjustments are nearly instantaneous. The focusing system on this phone has an interesting Jekyll and Hyde dual personality. When following 2 subjects in more controlled settings, you get a solid slide into focusing, which could almost pass for a rack focus. It's not as smooth as LG's solution, but it also doesn't overshoot as often as Samsung's focusing system. But even in controlled shots, it's got a bit of a stutter or a buzz to it, which isn't very pleasant. This is exacerbated by movement, focusing as you or your subject moves, where the result can be distractingly twitchy. Happily, this camera is very good at reporting focus lock, and in 3 days of intense shooting, I've had precious few instances of it reporting focus when it didn't have it, especially at macro distances, which is the Achilles heel of LG's and Samsung systems. However much faith you might put into the Zeiss branding, the optics are top-notch and deliver some great, crisp images at macro distances. Close focusing distances are now on par with other flagship cameras, with an absolutely gorgeous bokeh blur, and we don't see the fringing and distortion that can crop up from LG's lens. On our walking test, we have a very active optical image stabilization at play. Nokia was also first to introduce a little jello in their video, with a wide degree of movement from the lens. It's one of the features most criticized on LG cameras, and here we can arrive at shots which feel a bit rubbery too. It never really does calm down. Reactions to minor movements when the camera is mostly stationary still cause the OIS to twitch the lens more than it probably should. When combined with twitchy autofocus, you get some distractingly large reactions to somewhat minor changes in your scene. Microsoft has added a hybrid hardware and software stabilization mode when shooting 1080p video, but I still can't say I'm a fan of this on any phone. The changes in lens position subtly warp the frame, but when that's added to a software crop pan and scan style stabilization, the results look even buzzier and twitchier to me. I'd greatly prefer having the option to toggle hardware or software, both or no stabilization. Testing the zoom, Microsoft is preserving image integrity above all else. When shooting UHD, the zoom will only allow for a very small travel, making sure you actually have the resolution to retain detail and information. When shooting 1080p, you get a lot more range as you have more resolution to play with from that sensor to resample that 2 megapixel image. The 950 has terrific dynamic range and does a very good job of delivering a fast shutter in bright light for crisp movement, even at 30 frames per second. Only white cars are starting to clip, there's excellent detail throughout the scene. Color here still feels a bit exaggerated, and the autofocus sometimes overreacts to cars passing closer to the lens, but overall it's a vibrant, lush representation that's mostly pleasing to the eye. Our freeway test echoes that performance. The overall shot might be a little overexposed for my tastes here, but the 950 is still holding on to color info well, as only the brightest cars are clipping. It was an uncharacteristically windy week here in Los Angeles while I was testing the 950, so the mics and audio noise reduction were working overtime. Still, we have best-in-class audio reproduction. And if you'll pardon the vacation footage, I did get a little jazz captured on a recent trip to Disneyland. This will not be a normal part of my camera testing moving forward, though. There is a 120 frame per second slow motion mode, though results here fall far behind champs like the iPhone 6s. Also, the video is rendered and saved at 30 frames per second, baking in that 4x slow motion, so you don't have access to the original real-time file. This makes it easier to share slow motion videos, but it's a little trickier to dial in the kinds of speed ramps you see from the iPhone, where video morphs from real-time to slow motion gracefully. The autofocus and OIS twitchiness are magnified here though, as you spend 4 times more time with each adjustment. Historically, Windows phones have been terrible at our transition test, moving from dark to bright and back. The 950 is the best Windows phone we've ever run through this test, but it's still far from replicating the pleasant, blooming transitions we see from Samsung and Apple. Falling behind even LG, adjustments are fast, but brutal, swinging quickly in deliberate steps. We might see a sudden 2-stop jump, which feels like an overcorrection sometimes, and as lighting conditions change, we often lose focus on objects and the camera starts hunting around. I'm happy to see faster reaction times, but there's still plenty of room for improvement here. Now for some nighttime shots where exposure is very mature and restrained in daytime. I feel the camera tries a bit harder than it needs to in delivering brighter scenes at night. In this street scene, it's a super colorful, bright, juicy shot for night. Happily, we don't see overexposure to the point of blowing out street signs and billboards, but I still feel we could pull this back a half stop. The 950 is cranking the ISO to push the exposure on our creepy tunnel shot. There's no need for a scene like this to be exposed this bright, though I am happy to see that the lens is delivering a great street lamp here, almost perfect rays of light and no warping or deformation like we saw from the V10. The creepy gate shot is way off in terms of white balance, and the exposure again is super bright, leading to more ISO noise than I would like to see. Again, trying to adjust the white balance requires tens of seconds for the desired result to show up on video. The walkway shot clearly shows the color temperature differences between these two bulbs. They're not quite the same shade of white, though I can't help but feel we're losing detail and clarity because of this exposure. Microsoft's noise reduction is very conservative, but this shot still feels hazy. Some pink flowers lit by a porch lamp a couple yards away are very well exposed, though I again have some concerns over saturation. At least here, the tone and hue feel appropriate for a scene lit by a very yellow porch lamp. And lastly, a flower shot in almost no light. The 950 joins the LG V10 and the PureView in being able to lock focus on such a dimly lit subject, outpacing Samsung and Apple, who have struggled this year with low light focus locks. Moving over to still photos, I've got a lot of the same concerns with pictures that I do videos. There's a push towards white balance and saturation that makes scenes a bit punchier than I think they need to be. It's a really aggressive style of image processing. Lots of saturation and brightness seem to be applied in post when looking at the raw photos. It's also a bit disappointing that saving the raw file means we can only keep an 8 megapixel JPEG. We're not saving that much storage space, reducing the compressed file further. The raw file is already over 20 megabytes. Moving from a 16 to an 8 megapixel JPEG only saves us around 1 megabyte of storage space. Now, I'm not a fan of pixel peeping, but there's a stunning amount of detail captured by this sensor lens combination. It gives you a lot more confidence in cropping in on images or using the phone's zoom. Where the OIS is twitchy and jello-y for video, it provides great backup for still shots. Holding the shutter open for a quarter of a second or more sometimes, it's still really easy to land some good low-light shots from stationary subjects while hand-holding the camera. High-contrast lighting situations can still trip up this focusing system though. It's an old gremlin from the 1020 days that images like Christmas tree lights or city lights will sometimes confuse the camera enough to prevent any kind of focus lock. If I'm holding a Windows phone and looking at holiday lights, I pretty much give up and just switch over to manual focus. It's just a bit difficult to completely trust the JPEG output from this camera because of that image processing. Take this shot of streaking taillights. The max length of time you can hold open the shutter is 4 seconds, and I have the ISO set to its lowest setting. This is way too bright for those manual controls. A similar setup from the V10 required a 15-second exposure and still delivered a darker shot. Looking at the 950's RAW file, we see they're boosting this quite a bit, even though I dialed in the shutter and ISO. Microsoft calls their HDR mode Rich Capture Mode. Now, I'm not a big fan of HDR from phones, but thankfully this setting is very reserved in what it augments. Taking 2 or 3 bracketed exposures and merging them together, we get improved detail in lighter and darker sections of our shot. This performance gets us close to the HDR setting on the iPhone 6s, my current HDR leader. When shooting RAW, the camera will also retain the original RAW files in addition to the JPEG created. The only issue here is that Rich Capture is either off or in auto. I can't find a way to force it to stay on. Over 3 days of shooting, I have very few examples to show off as the camera ultimately decides when it will trigger a proper HDR shot. Even though this picture was saved and labeled as a rich capture shot, it shows almost zero difference from a normal phone photo saved with rich capture disabled. It's almost like the normal JPEG processing is already jacking up brightness and contrast to almost HDR levels anyway, so the camera will only force multiple bracketed shots for what it deems a more extreme lighting condition. If you want to roll your own HDR pics in post though, you can have the camera shoot a 3 or 5 shot set, but you'll have to blend those in post on your own from another computer. So where does that leave us with the camera on the Lumia 950? The last generation Windows phones were well ahead of the curve. The Lumia 1520 and 930 included camera technologies that absolutely shamed competitors, and it took almost 2 full years before Android cameras could properly unseat Nokia's hardware. The 950 is an improvement over those aged flagships, but it faces brutal competition from Samsung and LG now. This is an evolution which catches Microsoft back up to those rivals, but it doesn't surpass them. This is easily the best sensor and lens combo available on any phone today, but image processing feels like a backslide to the hyper-color days of oversaturated pics from Samsung. Disappointing from a smartphone team that used to be the gold standard for image reproduction. The Windows Phone camera app blazed an exciting trail, offering up prosumer photographic controls for consumer hardware, but it's been handily outclassed by LG's incredible array of controls, monitoring solutions, and settings. If it sounds like I'm being overly critical, it's because we're dealing with the best of the best, the pinnacle of smartphone camera builds on the market. We Windows Phone fans have been waiting a long time for this phone to arrive. I'm happy it's finally here, as this is a very good camera, but weighing all the pros and cons, comparing output, and comparing the various apps available, I just can't say it's the best camera of the year. In the top 3 opposite Samsung and LG? Absolutely. But it's not the best. As always, folks, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more reviews like these, and I would not be able to continue producing on this channel if you all weren't out there supporting it by hitting the fan funding, shopping, using the sponsored links below each video, or by purchasing my photography book. Take Better Photos, Smartphone Photography for Noobs is now available on Amazon Kindle and soon to be delivered on Google Play Books. Of course, sharing my videos is always appreciated. Reddit, Google+, Twitter, and the Facebook, so please keep bringing more cool people to the party. Hit that thumbs up button, and I will catch you all on the next review.